History does not always end with surrender papers or liberated gates. Sometimes it lingers. Inside families, inside children, inside memories that refuse to die. Long after the uniforms are burned and the banners fall, the past survives in quieter places. In inherited shame, in unanswered questions, in names that cannot be escaped. This is not a story about the camps themselves. It is about what happened after, to the children who grew up beside horror, and to the one child who never knew he had been born into it at all. In September 1967, a woman ended her life in a German prison cell. To the public, she was known as the Witch of Buchenwald, one of the most reviled figures to outlive the Nazi regime. But before she tore bedsheets into a rope and fixed them to a heating pipe, she wrote one final letter. Not to the daughter who had testified against her in court, not to the son who had publicly condemned her on the BBC before later taking his own life. She wrote instead to a man identified only as Ue, the child she had given birth to while imprisoned, a child who did not know she was his mother until he was 19, a child who would spend the rest of his life trying to prove that she had been innocent. This is the story of what became of Ilse's children, and why the one with the clearest path to escape became the most imprisoned of them all. To understand what happened to the children, we must first understand the world they were raised in. Ilse lived in the commandant's villa at Buchenwald with her husband, Karl Otto, and their 3 children, Artwin, Gisela, and little Gudrun. But this was no ordinary family home. The villa stood at the very edge of a concentration camp. The children played in manicured gardens with barbed wire visible beyond the hedges. Their mother rode horseback past prisoner labor details, crop in hand, while men in striped uniforms worked only yards away. The family ate fresh meat and vegetables, luxuries scarce even for ordinary Germans, while thousands starved within earshot of their dining table. Gudrun, the youngest, died in infancy in February 1941. She never lived long enough to carry the burden of the family name. Artwin and Gisela did. They grew up surrounded by death that they were trained not to notice. The camp became background noise. The prisoners became something less than human. This was normal life. The villa had a swimming pool. It had servants, prisoners assigned to domestic work. It had everything a powerful Nazi family could want. What it did not have was any boundary between childhood innocence and industrial murder. That closeness to horror would shape everything that came after. Every choice, every fracture, every attempt to escape the past. You might assume that Karl Otto died when the Allies arrived, when American forces liberated Buchenwald in April 1945. It would make sense. Commandants did not often survive those final days. But that is not how he died. The SS executed him first. On April 5, 1945, exactly 1 week before American troops reached the camp, Karl Otto was led before a firing squad made up of his own men. His crime was not mass murder, it was corruption. He had been skimming money from camp operations, diverting funds meant for Berlin. Worse, he had begun eliminating witnesses, killing prisoners and even SS personnel who knew too much. The regime could tolerate murder on an unimaginable scale. What it could not tolerate was theft from itself. His final words to his executioners were simple: "Boys, shoot well." His body was burned in the same crematorium that had consumed thousands of his victims. The children's father was killed by Nazis for being too corrupt, even by Nazi standards, but his death was only the beginning. Ilse was arrested in June 1945 after a former Buchenwald prisoner recognized her on a street in Ludwigsburg. She was tried in 1947 alongside 30 other camp defendants. Survivor testimony described her cruelty, her arbitrary punishments, her treatment of human beings as toys for her own amusement. In August 1947, the verdict came: life imprisonment. Then came the decision that ignited outrage across the United States. General Lucius Clay, the military governor of occupied Germany, reduced her sentence to 4 years. The official explanation was that the evidence against her personally, separate from her husband, did not justify life imprisonment. But what enraged the public was something else entirely. Ilse was pregnant. She had conceived a child while in internment under circumstances never fully clarified. The father was officially listed as unknown. Veterans groups protested, newspapers exploded. The New York Post branded the decision Clay's counter-atrocity. Woody Guthrie wrote a song bearing her name. Senate hearings followed. Demonstrations erupted in American cities. The outrage was so intense that when she was released from American custody in October 1949, West German authorities arrested her again immediately. The pregnancy that fueled that storm would become the final, tragic thread in her story. The child, no one's child. Uwe Kora was born in October 1947 in Landsberg prison, the same prison where Hitler had written Mein Kampf decades earlier. His father was listed as unknown, though records suggest he was likely a fellow German internee. No one pressed the matter. No one wanted to claim him. Within hours of birth, he was taken from his mother and placed with a Bavarian foster family. He grew up unaware of who he was. His foster parents gave him their surname. The name Koch never entered his world. Meanwhile, his siblings were left to navigate a Germany that remembered everything. Their father was dead. Their mother was imprisoned. Their family name had become synonymous with atrocity. Artwin and Gisela remembered the villa. They remembered the camp. They remembered their parents. Uwe had nothing but a birth certificate with a meaningless name. That absence, more than any memory, would define the rest of his life. Artwin the eldest chose open rejection. As a young man, he spoke to the BBC, publicly condemning his mother's crimes. He said he was ashamed, choosing the word carefully, knowing its weight. For a time, it seemed as though he might succeed in building a new identity through total disavowal. Germany was rebuilding. The future was supposed to belong to those who could let go. But some wounds do not heal simply because they are denounced. The memories remained. The knowledge remained. What had happened in that villa could not be undone. And Artwin carried it with him, every single day. In 1964, at just 26 years old, Artwin Koch took his own life. It happened 9 months before his mother would hang herself inside that same prison system. The son who had condemned her most loudly could not survive the weight of her name. Public rejection was not enough. Words were not strong enough. The damage ran deeper than any interview or declaration could reach. The middle child, Gisela, chose a different path. When West German authorities put Ilse Koch on trial once more in November 1950, Gisela appeared in court, not for the defense, but for the prosecution. At 16 years old, she testified against her own mother. She described life inside the villa, what she had seen, what she had heard, what had been normal to her as a child. Then she erased herself. She severed every remaining tie to the Koch name with precision and discipline. She earned a business degree. She became a banker, successful, respected, and deliberately unremarkable. She married a man whose surname happened to be Koch, unrelated by blood, allowing her to carry a common name without its poisoned history. She raised 2 children far from the shadow of Buchenwald, in a Germany eager to forget what it no longer wished to face. In 1984, Gisela founded a charitable organization supporting women. She served as its chair for more than a decade. When she died in November 2018 at the age of 76, her obituary in Bremen praised her philanthropy, her career, her civic service. The word Buchenwald did not appear. Gisela proved that escape was possible, but the cost was absolute rupture, standing in a courtroom and helping condemn the woman who gave her life. Most would call that justice. But it is worth remembering that she had to testify against her own mother before she could become anyone else. Uwe Kora grew up in his foster home knowing nothing of any of this. At 8 years old, he noticed a name on his birth certificate. It meant nothing to him, just ink on paper. Why would a child in 1955 recognize the name Koch? The war had ended a decade earlier. He had school, friends, a normal life. Everything changed in 1966. At 19, Uwe opened a newspaper and saw a headline, "No pardon for Koch." The article described an aging woman in prison, an infamous inmate who had repeatedly petitioned for clemency and been denied. They called her the Witch of Buchenwald. They recounted her crimes, her trials, her notoriety. He recognized the name. That Christmas, he visited Eichach Women's Prison for the first time. Later, he described the experience as deeply unsettling. He had come face to face with a woman the world regarded as a monster. And what did he see? A mother, a stranger, a myth made flesh. Unlike Artwin and Gisela, who had grown up in the villa with its proximity to horror, Uwe encountered his mother's story as an outsider. He had no memories to contradict her, only her words, and she had spent decades preparing them. Uwe began visiting her monthly. During those visits, Ilse Koch told him everything he wanted to hear. The accusations were lies. The trials were political theater. The American courts were, in her words, corrupt and vindictive. The stories of cruelty and sadism were fabrications. Even the infamous allegations about lampshades, she insisted, had never been proven. She pointed out, accurately, that American military lawyers had once deemed the evidence inconclusive. Uwe believed her. He had nothing else to believe. He had no childhood memories of the villa, no images of prisoners, no lived experience to contradict her narrative. He saw only a frail, aging woman who cried when he visited, who spoke of injustice, who insisted she had been imprisoned for decades for crimes she did not commit. What 19-year-old would want to believe otherwise? After her suicide in 1967, Uwe launched a lifelong campaign to rehabilitate her name. In 1971, he wrote to the New York Times, arguing that she had been a victim of mass hysteria and Cold War politics. He contacted historians, journalists, anyone who might listen. Later, historians would describe Uwe as Ilse Koch's final victim, a child separated at birth, raised in ignorance, who became her most devoted defender precisely because he never knew who she truly was. The circumstances that should have freed him, his removal from her care, his foster family, his new name, became the very mechanism of his captivity. On September 1, 1967, Ilse Koch hanged herself in her cell at Koch prison. She was 60 years old. She had spent 24 years in custody, first American, then German, and never once admitted guilt. Her suicide note was addressed to Uwe. "There is no other way. Death for me is a release, not to Gisela, who had testified against her and escaped. Not to the memory of Artwin, who had condemned her and died. To the son who believed her. To the only one who might carry her version of history forward." Prison records noted that her mental state had deteriorated in her final years. She suffered delusions, believing survivors would break into her cell to torment her. She complained of unseen persecutors, imagined assaults. She died believing herself the victim of a vast injustice, perhaps the only role she ever fully embraced. The note to Uwe revealed where she had placed her final hope. Her other children were gone, by escape or by death. Only the prison-born son remained loyal. Only he could be trusted with her legacy. 3 paths from the same shadow. Ilse Koch left behind 3 children who reached adulthood. Each answered the same impossible question in a different way. How do you live with a mother like this? Gisela chose betrayal. She testified against her mother, erased her past, and built a life so ordinary that history barely noticed her. It worked, but only because she severed herself completely. Artwin chose death. He rejected his mother publicly, declared his shame, and tried to outrun the name through condemnation. The memories followed him anyway. He died at 26. Uwe chose denial. Born in prison, raised by strangers, he met his mother only as an old woman claiming innocence. With no memories to contradict her, he believed her. He spent decades trying to prove the impossible, that the witch of Buchenwald was not a perpetrator, but a victim. After 1971, Uwe largely disappears from the historical record. Whether he ever abandoned her defense, whether he ever accepted the truth, remains unknown. Some stories do not resolve. What historians still debate is not what Ilse Koch did. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is extensive. Her guilt is beyond reasonable doubt. The question that lingers is something else entirely. Can anyone raised in the shadow of such evil ever truly escape it? Or are betrayal, death, and denial the only exits? 3 children, 3 answers, none of them clean.